Hey guys, today we're going to be taking a look at Doom: The Dark Ages on the Intel Arc B580 GPU. You can see all of its specs over here in GPU-Z. We have 12 gigabytes of GDDR6 video memory. Up here in MSI Afterburner, you can see we actually don't have any sort of control over overclock or anything like that within MSI Afterburner. We will be using it, however, for our monitoring. And I should mention we are using the Intel Limited Edition version of the card. And over here in the Intel graphics software, you can see we are on the most up-to-date driver with resizable bar on, pairing with a 9800 X3D and 64 gigabytes of DDR5 RAM. So this is definitely overkill, the RAM configuration, but again, we're just trying to see what the actual GPU can do, so eliminating all other bottlenecks. So both the CPU and memory are probably, overkill for most configurations running a B580, but just to see what the GPU can do in ideal conditions. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, we'll be starting off here at 1080p. And for our anti-aliasing at 1080p, I definitely want the best form of anti-aliasing that we can use. So we are going to use XeSS native anti-aliasing. You do have TAA available as well as FSR. TAA in particular would probably get you, from what I can tell, just testing really briefly, about a 5% increase. So if you are okay with less, good looking anti-aliasing, go for TAA. However, at 1080p, in my opinion, it's good to, go that extra step there and get really good anti-aliasing. And we're going to start off here on the low preset. We're not going to test every single preset because there are 6 of them. There's just a ton of them. It would be like over an hour long if we really went extensively and tested each of them. But we're going to start at low just to kind of see at, a base level, what can we expect. And here you can see we'll go ahead and get started. And again, this is with Intel XeSS anti-aliasing. So a relatively, expensive form of anti-aliasing. It's not quite as expensive as DLAA on NVIDIA cards, but it is certainly more expensive than if we were to just use, default TAA. And, at low settings here, we're getting above 60, which is definitely nice to see that we can get a native 60 plus FPS experience here. The B580, is definitely a affordable, kind of budget-oriented graphics card, so it is nice to see that we can play, a newer game here at 60 plus FPS without even utilizing any sort of upscaling. However, we will see if that holds true as we kind of enter into our first big combat area. And while it is a budget card, it is certainly nice to see that we have those 12 gigabytes of our video memory. And even in, this more intensive area with a bunch of action going on, we are still holding on well above that 60 FPS average. It's like we're dipping into the low 70s at times and even into like the very high 60s in super intensive scenes, but really, in my opinion, the low settings still look really solid in this game. It doesn't really look like a ton different between low and some of the other settings, but it's also not really super different in terms of our performance. But if you just want bare bones native 1080p experience, you can get a 60 plus FPS here, which is definitely pretty nice to see. And like we've seen with all of my testing on this game, we have an incredibly smooth frame time graph. Is another thing that's really nice to see. So as we kind of continue on here with a bit more combat, you can see our average is kind of coming down right around 80 FPS. Definitely a playable experience here, but you may want to be in a more high refresh rate territory. So let's see what just applying some slight upscaling will do. So one thing I do really like about XeSS is that they have a lot of different options. Oftentimes like DLSS and FSR, they will just have quality, balance, performance, and ultra performance, but here we actually do get ultra quality and ultra quality plus. So we're just going to bump it down just a little bit to ultra quality plus. And that does now put us immediately at 100 FPS here in our outdoor area. And as we kind of continue on, we'll see where that kind of averages out as we begin a little bit more of an intensive scene. As far as our image quality goes, in my opinion, it still looks really solid. Across the board, like every GPU that I've tested on this game seems to actually, all of their respective anti-aliasing and upscaling technologies actually look really great. So this does get us to just about 110 on our average here. Definitely a really strong experience. And if you had, a high refresh rate screen, like 144 hertz or something like that, you can pretty well populate it. Not all the way at ultra quality here, but definitely get a really solid and consistent frame time. So our 1% low is also still pretty solid, and as you can see, our frame times are still really flat. So not only is it giving us a high FPS, it's delivering those frames at a really consistent rate. Now here at Ultra Quality, you do see a little bit of weirdness with some of these fine details off in the distance. You can kind of see the gray on the floor as we're kind of inching forward, how they kind of come into frame. And like, I'm not sure if that's the anti-aliasing that's at fault, but a little bit of weirdness I did notice there. But really, in general, here at low settings, you do have a pretty solid experience. And even without the upscaling, you'd get a high FPS. And if you wanted a bit higher, you just need to introduce just the slightest bit of upscaling. And now, you know, we're getting above 100 FPS on our average here. Definitely a really solid experience. All right, going back to native here and now bumping up to the high preset. And here at native and high settings, we are still getting a 60 plus experience here to begin with. We'll see how that kind of hangs on as we do a bit of combat and get into a bit more of intensive scene. But, you know, pretty much any GPU, regardless of if it's a budget GPU, what I would like to see is at least at 1080p being able to deliver a 60 FPS experience on, you know, high settings at 1080p. So the fact that we are right around 60, at least to begin with, is reassuring. And as we come into our more intensive area here, we'll keep an eye on our FPS, dipping below 60 at times into the 50s. So we are actually dipping quite a bit into like 52. Looks like is our 1% low there. Not a terrible experience, but, you know, certainly not a consistent 60 FPS all the time. So not at the end of the world, still getting, you know, well above 60 FPS on our average, just not quite getting 60 FPS all the time. So definitely in like more intensive scenes like this, pretty consistently below 60 FPS. However, you know, as soon as like we kind of relax a little bit, maybe get less, you know, less things on our screen, kind of look at a less intensive area, we do start climbing back up to above 60, but here at high settings, I don't know, it's borderline. I mean, you're getting a 60 FPS average, but you are pretty consistently dipping below that 60 FPS. So again, let's just go ahead and dump down just to Ultra Quality Plus. So here at Ultra Quality Plus, which I believe uses 77% resolution scale, so it's just about 830p and still looks really solid. Actually, it's not even really the XeSS that's doing like so great. From what I can see, it's really just the fact the game seems to really perform well with upscaling in general. So here we are getting, you know, a much more consistent 60 plus experience. And honestly, it looks close enough, in my opinion, to native that you could trick me into thinking that this is 1080p native. I still think it looks really, really solid. And our frame time graph is still incredibly smooth. The overall experience is still relatively like similar to, you know, native. Definitely not, you know, very, very noticeably different. And certainly worth it just to get a bit more of a smooth experience here, in my opinion. And even in like a really intensive, you know, scene, like a lot of combat here, you can see we're still getting, you know, above 60 FPS pretty consistently. We do have one more area with like an explosion coming up, or a chain of explosions coming up. It'll be interesting to see if we are able to maintain 60 plus FPS all the time there. So if we come into this area with all these exploding barrels and go ahead and explode them, you can see still not dipping down below 60 FPS. So definitely a really strong experience here. I would say if you want to play at high settings, in my opinion, it's worth enabling that upscaling because you are still getting a good image and you're getting a much, much smoother experience here. So averaging out right around 86 with no real noticeable drops here. And our last setting at 1080p is going to be Ultra Nightmare, so completely maxed out settings at native resolution. Now this is, you know, max settings before the update that will introduce path tracing, you know, which will make it a bit hard, I'd imagine, but let's see what Ultra Nightmare looks like, at least right now. And here, starting off at Ultra Nightmare, still getting 80 FPS to begin with, but you know, as we saw with some of our previous testing, we aren't really expecting that to hold true as we go into a bit more intensive scenes, already going into the 60s as we begin kind of running around here. But really, you know, and I don't know if it's just because the update hasn't hit with the path tracing, and that's really the intended feature for Ultra Nightmare, but really not a super substantial or noticeable dip in our FPS when introducing these higher settings. And let's see how this looks as we kind of begin our most intensive scene here with our huge room full of enemies. And just like at our high settings, we are dipping down into the 50s pretty consistently, although we are still holding that 60 FPS average, due to the fact that we did obviously start our run a little bit before out in a less intensive area. But honestly, not too bad of an experience here. I'm not really noticing like a ton of issues here. And although our frame rate is dropping below 60 at times, it's not really dropping too far below 60, and really it's not dropping below 60 in a super aggressive way, meaning that, you know, if you look at our frame time graph as we kind of dip below that 60 FPS mark, we're not doing it like all at once super quickly as far as like stuttering or anything like that. So, you know, it's not as bad as a lot of other games that are coming out recently. You know, it seems like a lot of modern games nowadays, you know, the issue is not so much that they're intensive, the issue is that they're just poorly optimized, and they, you know, they have like a ton of stuttering. So luckily this game is not poorly optimized. It's actually a pretty well optimized game. So finishing that area here, 61 FPS average. Obviously, you know, watching our FPS there, if we were to start counting our FPS before that scene, we would probably be, you know, pretty well below that 60 FPS average, but just on average here, getting right around 60 FPS. And again, let's just go ahead and introduce our Ultra Quality Plus preset here, rendering at 77% of our resolution scale. And just like before, we're right around 70 or 80 FPS. We'll see if that does dip as we kind of get into a bit more intensive of a combat experience here. And not really dipping below 60 FPS now that we have this upscaling applied. So definitely a pretty strong experience. So it seems just with a touch of upscaling, we are able to reclaim that FPS and be in a 60 plus FPS, you know, territory here. Definitely a really strong experience in my opinion. You know, if you want to crank settings, all you have to do to maintain 60 FPS is just put on Ultra Quality Plus upscaling with XeSS, and really still looks really solid, and you get the added benefit of, you know, really good looking anti-aliasing, pretty much removing any of those jaggies. And of course, with any upscaling, the other nice part is that all of our UI elements are being rendered at our native resolution of 1080p, so it's really just the actual game itself that kind of dumps down our settings. So definitely a really strong experience. And as we, you know, if we go ahead and start introducing some of these explosions and things, you can see not really dipping down too much, going down into like the high 70s at times, or 1% lows at 71, but, you know, really strong experience here. And seems like if you are, you know, using a B580 at 1080p, which I really do think is the best resolution to see this video card shine, you are going to have a really strong experience here on you know, Doom, the Dark Ages. And now bumping up our resolution to 1440p here, and starting off native at our low preset. So starting off here in our beginning zone, right around 70 FPS. So obviously, if our previous tests were anything to go by, this will certainly drop below that 60 FPS. Actually, it's already dropping below 60 FPS. So the game really does seem to, you know, dump down in FPS far more greatly when you increase resolution as opposed to increasing settings. The settings really, like, you're looking at maybe like a 10-15% performance difference going from the lowest to the highest setting. It's not super noticeable, but the resolution certainly is. So it doesn't look like you're really going to be able to play anything at 1440p at native, that is, unless you are okay with getting sub 60 FPS. And in our most intensive area here in this big room, we're getting into the 40s at times, 47. So definitely, you know, it's still playable, certainly. It's just not really, in my opinion, you know, the type of performance that you typically want to be having on a Doom game. These games really, in my opinion, tend to feel the best when you're at a super high FPS. Like, even in the 100s, in my opinion, is really what feels the best. However, you know, we are playing a AAA game, and we're playing at a, you know, a pretty premier resolution at 1440p. You're still working with a $250 GPU, so, which is a, you know, price range that is basically completely vacant aside from Intel. So I am certainly happy that they're even, you know, participating with making GPUs and making them at this price point. But obviously, you know, around 50 FPS with dips into the 40s is not really, in my opinion, the type of experience that you want to be having. So let's go ahead and immediately throw on our upscaling here. Now, ultra quality upscaling at 1440p now is rendering from 1109p, approximately, somewhere around there, which is 77% of our resolution scale. So starting off here, we are getting 60 plus FPS. And again, even at 1440p, the image still looks incredibly sharp. Now, one thing I will say is that if you look here, both DLSS and FSR have their own independent sharpness slider. XeSS, for whatever reason, does not. So if we do want to adjust our sharpening, we are going to have to actually adjust it at a system level or at a base level. So I am going to bump this up just to 2.0. The only bummer about this is that, when we go back to native, we're going to have to bump this up and down. If you're a normal person and you're only adjusting settings every once in a while, then it probably is not as big of an issue, but I definitely do prefer when games kind of, give you that option on a more minute level, the upscaling tied to or the sharpening tied to the upscaler is something that I do definitely prefer. And as you can see now, we are getting pretty solidly above that 60 FPS pretty much all the time. 1% low is just a touch under 60 FPS to begin with here, but pretty close to right around 60 FPS all the time. Now our 1% low is back to 60, average at 70. So just with that slightest bit of upscaling, we are able to play here at 1440p, low settings, no problem whatsoever. So definitely a pretty strong experience here at 1440p, so long as you are okay with just the slightest bit of upscaling. And of course we are at low settings, but I do expect this, as we'll test, to perform pretty well as we do begin bumping up settings. But really, you can look at it kind of two ways. In my opinion, the game doesn't really look super different when you bump up settings, but it also doesn't really perform very differently. So my opinion, it's probably worth jumping up in our settings, maybe to high, at least as a base point, just because you're able to kind of get similar performance. So let's go ahead and test that out. All right, next setting here, we're actually going to keep with Ultra Quality Plus, since we weren't at 60 FPS, even on low settings, we're not going to get there on any higher settings, and at our high preset. So high preset, Ultra Quality Plus upscaling. All right, so here on the high preset with Ultra Quality upscaling, we are kind of starting off right around 70, which again doesn't really bode super well for our first more intensive type scene, since that does typically drop us about 15 or so FPS. So we'll keep continuing on here, already kind of touching into the 50s briefly there, and there again into 59, 58. So unfortunately, it does look like we are going to have to use a bit more aggressive of an upscaling, but we'll go ahead and get started here. And in this big combat zone here, we are getting below 60 FPS even on Ultra Quality preset. So we are going to have to use a bit more aggressive upscaling here at high in order to get that 60 FPS. Now this definitely does seem to be our most intensive area here, so you would probably be getting 60 FPS in a lot of other scenes. It's just, when the game gets really intensive, closed areas, a lot of enemies, a lot of effects going on, that seems to be where you're going to be having most of your problems. But honestly, it's really close to 60 FPS. Our average is still right at 60 FPS, and we are going back there at times, but pretty consistently dipping below into the 50s. Not into the 40s or anything at this point, but you may want definitely better performance here. So while we're still in this more intensive scene, let's go ahead and drop down from Ultra Quality Plus down into just regular old Ultra Quality, which is now rendering from a 1080p image. And here at Ultra Quality, we are getting back that real nice 60 FPS experience here. So definitely feels much smoother, and really just pretty impressed with the performance, mainly due to the fact that this this GPU is really, in my opinion, I think it's a 1080p card, and it can be stretched to 1440p. So the fact that we are at 1440p high settings, and we can go ahead and stop here in a scene here and just, or maybe let's find a bit of a better scene. But if we come here and just kind of zoom in on some different scenes here, or different objects, you can see the image still looks really sharp, and it's kind of hard to show while zooming in motion, but even in motion, it's still a really clean looking image, and I would definitely be able to be fooled that this is a native 1440p image. So if we look at like something that's moving, like here, let's go ahead and frame like that flag off in the difference, off in the distance there, you can see even in motion, there's no like noticeable ghosting, artifacting, anything like that. All of like the blue flames on these little lanterns, everything still looks really solid here at Ultra Quality upscaling. So, in my opinion, it's definitely worth, getting 60 FPS, playing at 1440p, high settings. It's a really strong experience here, and definitely a good showcase for the card to be running a AAA game at, high settings and 60 plus FPS with pretty much imperceptible upscaling. You know, the last game I benchmarked before Doom, like extensively, was the Oblivion remake. And when you compare the work that's been done to make these upscalers actually work well, is really night and day difference. This game just really seems to still look really solid, even with pretty aggressive upscaling. We're not on the aggressive upscaling yet. We'll certainly have to introduce some of that aggressive upscaling when we attempt our 4K testing, so that'll definitely be interesting to see if we can get a convincing 4K image. But definitely here at 1440p, you can get a very, very convincing looking, good quality image here without really much of any compromises. And the last setting we'll test here at 1440p still is our, we're going to actually go native here and Ultra Nightmare. So we know we're going to be below 60 FPS here at native 1440p, but I do just kind of want to see what kind of performance we can expect here. Now the card is kind of like a cross between a 1080p and a 1440p card, so completely maxed out settings here. Is asking a bit much from the card, but we'll see what we get. And starting off here, we're just below 60 FPS, kind of just standing still. Looks fluid, looks clean. Looks like we are dipping a bit more below immediately as we kind of begin moving around. So no major surprise, but it is a sub 60 FPS experience here at Ultra Nightmare 1440p. And even as we begin running around here, loading in some new areas, we are still, now we're dipping into the 40s. One thing that you might notice though is our video memory is actually no problem whatsoever. So we have 12 gigabytes of video memory. We're not even hitting 10 gigabytes. So definitely nice that we have over 8 playing at 1440p. But the 12 gigabytes, it was enough on the 5070, and it certainly seems to be enough here on the B580. Definitely nice and generous of Intel to give us those 12 gigabytes. And let's just do a bit of combat here. We know we're not going to be 60 FPS, but I do, I'm a little bit curious just if this is even somewhat of a playable experience. And while it is playable here, we are getting dips all the way down into the 30s, so not really where you'd want to be. So let's go ahead and throw on some of that upscaling, and we're going to go straight down to ultra quality here and hope that this works. Again, this is a 1080p picture here, and I'm hoping that this gets us right around 60 FPS with no major dips below 60 FPS. And it does look like we are getting, pretty consistently 60 FPS. No major dips into the 50s. We're close to the 50s, but we are getting a pretty, oh, there's a dip actually into 55. Okay, so actually we are dipping into the 50s a bit here at quality. So, while that is not super noticeable, and honestly, if I'd have my frame counter on, I may not even have noticed that we were dipping below 60 FPS. Because that is our target here in general, we do want to be right around 60 FPS. Let's go ahead and introduce even more upscaling. So we're going to go ahead and just turn on our quality upscaling. And quality upscaling is now rendering from 66% resolution scale, or 950p. And as you can see, it does give us a pretty major boost there, all the way into right around 80 FPS. So obviously, this is a slightly less intensive zone now, especially considering the fact that pretty much all of our enemies are gone. Looks like there's still one more hanging out here. But I am pretty confident that this would maintain 60 plus FPS all the time. And, here at quality, it still looks pretty good. I can't really notice, honestly, a major difference. And I am actually someone who's typically pretty good and, good or not good, however you want to think about it, but I usually can tell when an image is being upscaled. So the fact that, like if we look off again at the flag and the flame, all of that, is kind of off the distance stuff that's in motion, there's no really major issues that I can tell whatsoever. The image does look a tad bit softer, which is another reason that I would like to see the option to come in here. And of course we can adjust the sharpening, on like a basics settings level, but I do wish we could adjust it on a upscaling level, just due to the fact that, when you dump down settings or dump down into more aggressive upscalers, you typically want to be able to go in and change that sharpening. So not a huge deal, it's just a bit more work, but not a huge deal. But yeah, getting well above 60 FPS pretty much all the time. Even our 1% lows are above 60 FPS. So Ultra Nightmare, 1440p resolution, and you do have to introduce some upscaling, but really the game is so good at tricking you into thinking that this upscaled image is still, really pretty much native. So in my opinion, I would say total pass here at 1080p and even 1440p on this GPU. All right, the last resolution that we'll be testing here is 4K. Now, of course, 4K on a B580, it is certainly possible, but it is pushing the card definitely to its limits. So I will check out what we can do with our native resolution here, but we're going to start off here just native low. And as you can see, we are still below our VRAM target here, so we're not quite getting that warning. As you can see, when we start bumping up some settings, it starts to climb. Although it's actually not really, even seems like highest settings, it's not really going to be an issue as far as this little counter here down here is concerned, at least. But yeah, let's just start off here 4K native resolution and low settings. Now here on native 4K low settings, we are starting off right around in the 30s. However, this is our least intensive area here, so as soon as we kind of start dipping below 30 now into the 20s, this is immediately, before we even enter any combat, this is where I'd consider to be, unplayable territory. So unfortunately, not that it's a huge surprise, but we are going to have to start introducing some of that upscaling right away. The other thing to note is that although the video memory and the menu didn't show it as being a problem, we are actually climbing pretty high in our allocated video memory there. So even at low settings here, I am going to actually come down immediately and put this into our balanced preset. And right off the bat here, balance does give us above 60 FPS. And honestly, the upscaling is so great in this game that it doesn't really look that far off of native, I have to say. Of course, the other benefit that using the upscaling has for us is that it does give our video memory a bit of a breather. So now we're sitting, under 10 gigabytes when we were essentially right at our max. Now, video memory is a bit hard to kind of track in some ways because there's a difference between allocated video memory and actually used video memory, but regardless, it's very clear that it's not an issue quite yet. So let's go ahead and enter into, as our enemies are actually coming to us, but let's go into our more intensive area and see if we can hang on to that 60 FPS. And it does look like even down here at balanced preset, we are still dipping below that 60 FPS pretty consistently, right around 57 on our average, sometimes 56, so we are certainly below 60 FPS, unfortunately. However, it's pretty close to 60 FPS, and depending on how picky you were, you may be able to play at this frame rate. It's not really so far off of 60 that it feels like a sluggish experience or anything like that. But I do want a consistent 60 plus FPS experience here, so let's go ahead and go to performance. So performance is using 1080p as our base resolution, so I'm pretty confident now, just based on our 1080p testing, that we will be above 60 FPS, and it does look like we are. And while this is definitely not a review of XeSS or upscalers in general, I do have to say that in my opinion it looks really sharp. I'm not really noticing a ton of difference here from the native resolution, and these are not scientific tests or side-by-side versus native or anything like that, but in my opinion, it's still really strong looking image. And now, it's definitely, of course, in my opinion, worth it, considering the fact that we are now getting, really consistently a 60 plus FPS experience. So even, our 1% lows are just about 60, so really consistently above 60 FPS. Of course, we are at low settings here, so I don't know, playing at 4K low, in my opinion, it's kind of a weird setting to play at. Like, I imagine if you want to populate a 4K image, you actually want like good quality visuals. Now, this game doesn't look bad on low settings, so it may be okay, but I would say that, if you're playing at 4K, you want to go at least high settings on a game like this. So let's stay on performance upscaling here, but now, of course, we just want to bump up to high settings. So definitely, more realistic to, in my opinion, what someone at 4K may want to actually play at. And we're starting off here right around 70 FPS, already dipping into the 60s. So it looks like high settings, I don't know. I do think that this will probably be dipping below 60 FPS here, considering the fact that we're already dipping below 60 barely here. just running through. So we'll see how this looks. I mean, the image quality still looks great at performance, so we'll see if ultra performance can help get us there. And if it can't, then that's where we'll have to start utilizing that frame generation with FSR. And it does look like we're close to 60 FPS here, but not quite. So in the 50s here, it doesn't really look like we're dipping much lower than the 50s, not into the 40s or anything like that here at high settings. But really, I really can't overstate how good this looks for, using 1080p as our base resolution. So, ultra performance, which is kind of going to be our next stop here, is going to be using, of course, 720p as our base resolution, which is definitely lower, but I am interested to see. So right around 55 or so there, let's go ahead and jump in and let's bump down to ultra performance. So this is now going to be using 720p as our base resolution, which is a good bit less than 1080p. So I am expecting us to be in 60 FPS, and it does look like this does get us right about 60 FPS. So 60 FPS, high settings, 4K with, all of our upscaling cranked pretty much all the way. And now while XeSS is actually really solid in my opinion, this is asking a lot of it. Pretty much, even DLSS or FSR4, this would be asking a lot. Upscaling from 720p is a pretty gargantuan task. So we will try to take a look, and again, I'm not really noticing any sort of like major artifacting or anything like that. If we like throw our shield out, some motion, it all seems to actually still look essentially native. I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm losing my touch for being able to tell this stuff, but in my opinion, it looks really, really close to native. I can't really tell a major difference here. And I can't overstate how impressive I always find these upscaling techniques. Not just that we're able to get a high FPS, but more so the fact that we're able to get a high FPS without really sacrificing much, if any at all, in terms of image quality. This is definitely a fast-paced game, so, we're not really slowing down looking at like fine details and things like that. But honestly, I can't really even tell like a huge drop in performance. I mean, it definitely looks a bit softer. That can, again, be fixed with upscaling. Or not upscaling, that softness can be kind of, maybe not fixed all the way, but definitely addressed with that sharpening slider. But definitely a real solid experience here, and we are stretching the limits of the card, but thankfully, going through and stretching the limits is not really resulting in too bad of a quality. You can see here at 4K, even with that, ultra performance upscaling, it's not resulting in that issue with the grates that we were having at lower resolutions. So, upscaling to a higher resolution does have its benefits. It's not always better to, use less aggressive upscaling. And, well, that's pretty brutal there. But yeah, definitely really strong performance here. Definitely really happy that, I honestly, I was not expecting to be able to play this game at 4K 60 high settings. With this good of image quality. Really, really impressive. Good response times, of course. Typically when you introduce upscaling, especially when you're using like Intel XeSS or DLSS, or actually really any of them, as long as you're not just using base resolution scaling, you are also getting the benefit of, some of that reduced input latency. So there is a bit of flickering going on, like down at the grate, you'll notice that there. So a bit of weirdness if you kind of like pay close attention, but honestly, just kind of playing through the game, a lot of like, you will notice there is film grain applied to the game. So some of that doesn't look so great with the upscaling in particular, especially like these hazy type scenes. There's like all these dots everywhere, but in general, my opinion, looks really, really great here, and definitely worth the trade-off to get a 60 plus FPS experience. And our last preset here, Ultra Nightmare, sticking with Ultra Performance, since that's what got us to 60 before. But we'll just see, see if this can actually get us to max 4K settings at 60 plus FPS. And starting off here at 80 FPS, which is certainly a very promising start here. As we begin to kind of run around here, we're not dipping down into the 60s even yet. We're still at 70. So, man, this GPU, every time I benchmark this GPU, I just come away impressed every single time. Now, if this can hold strong, Ultra Nightmare in this room at 60 plus FPS, of course, we are using Ultra Performance upscaling, so don't want to, forget about that. This is obviously not native. We will definitely take a look at what native looks like just out of curiosity, but Yeah, wow, 60 plus FPS, ultra nightmare. Of course, we are using ultra performance, but really, I know it's hard to tell in a YouTube video, but I really recommend if you have this GPU, don't be afraid to crank settings and use some of that aggressive upscaling, because really it works so well here. So our 1% lows here are at 58, so we are dipping below 60, like just barely at times. I saw another dip there at 59, but really pretty strong performance here, and our dips are really gradual enough. Our frame time graph is still incredibly flat that it does feel like an incredibly smooth experience here, and this is with everything cranked, so ultra nightmare settings at ultra performance. So we'll kind of come out here and just, take a look at some of those scenes off in the distance, maybe like the flags, things like that. And yeah, to be honest with you, like we can zoom in on maybe a flag off in the distance. No noticeable ghosting or anything like that. Really strong image here. So super impressed. Now we will, just because we're curious, let's go ahead and just see what we could get 4K and now at native here. So native XeSS, and actually I'm going to use TAA. So this is using temporal anti-aliasing. Not the most expensive anti-aliasing at this point, and the reason I'm doing that is just because when you go to 4K, you don't really need super expensive anti-aliasing anymore, and we're going to get back a bit of that FPS, but here you can see this is the native picture here, so you have to tell me, does this look like noticeably worse now or noticeably better as far as like the image quality? In my opinion, it definitely looks sharper, I will say, but it's not like night and day difference. If we zoom in maybe on like a particular scene, definitely looks like, if we zoom in on the little flagpole up here, it definitely looks sharper, looks better. I'm not going to say it doesn't, but of course, this is unplayable at a, averaging below 30 FPS as we begin to run around, getting into the 20s. But honestly, for the price of this GPU, I'm just like super impressed that we can even fake it with these settings and get a 60 plus experience here. So again, this is, we'll do a side-by-side actually while we're here. So I'll do a cut here. So this is completely native. This is using TAA, but no upscaling. This is just TAA for the anti-aliasing solution. So take a look at this image. This is native 4K. And now this is that same exact scene, but upscaled using that ultra performance XeSS. So, it does look softer. I will say it doesn't look quite as good, but my opinion, you're getting such a better performance here, and it's doing a pretty convincing job faking it, that in my opinion, it looks pretty impressive here, I have to say. Maybe I'm too easily impressed, but overall, the B580, every time I test this card, I come away more and more impressed. I really do think there's definitely not a better card for $250 new, and the main reason for that is just the fact that there really isn't any other options around this price point new. You're really going to have to go at least at $300. Now we do have the 5060 coming out at the end of the month here, so it'll be interesting to see kind of how that looks in comparison, and that'll be pretty comparable in price. And of course, it will have all of those DLSS features, multi-frame generation, all that sort of stuff. But no need to even enable frame generation at any point. I'd way rather personally go for the more aggressive upscaling, because the upscaling really is implemented in such a great way that I would far prefer going for that. So anyways, that's been it. The B580 here in Doom the Dark Ages. Super strong performance, and definitely a card that is worth checking out, especially if you are in that kind of like budget build type of price range. You're looking at like a couple $100 for a GPU. $250 if you can get it MSRP, which is not always the easiest thing to do, but if you can, I think it remains one of the best buys that you can have around that price point. All right, thank you guys so much for watching. Take care. I'll see you guys in the next one.